Welcome to Living in the Matrix. I'm Jonathan, and I'm left of center.
And I'm Rich, and I tend to lean a little bit more to the right. But the bottom line is together we try to look for the balance of what it means to be human in today's world.
Welcome to Living in the Matrix, everyone. I'm Jonathan. This is Rich. Say hi, Rich.
Hey, everybody. Great to be back.
It's good. It's good to have you back, bro. You've been gone. You've been traveling and working. Give everybody an update on what you've been doing.
It's just been really, really busy work week, at the end of a quarter, always a busy time in sales, and spent some time in upstate New York for an important offsite event, Pasadena, and at a business conference. And then last week I was in Indianapolis for another conference helping out a partner play. So it's been crazy. It was an amazing quarter in terms of business wise, over 350% of plan. So it's been a great quarter, but now it's time to kind of get back to the roots and to do the things that we love and that are important in terms of mental and spiritual and physiological debate. So great to be back, man.
Awesome. And before we gloss over something important that you said, because you kind of just threw it out there and then didn't talk about it. When we started this podcast, you and I have really been exploring the concept of manifesting. We really started manifesting last summer. What is your perception? Because you are literally having the best year of your career. What's your perception kind of in self-reflection? How much do you think that played a part? Because you and I have been sort of actively dialoguing and practicing this concept of manifesting. How much do you give credit to that?
Well, it's funny. I'm trying to figure out if it's tapping into the unified field through TM, through transcendental meditation, or the idea of actually willfully manifesting. And I will tell you that I don't willfully, intentionally manifest that often. I will tell you that straight up. I don't even pray as much as I used to. I used to pray all the time. I'd get up in the morning, do my stretches, open a passage in the Bible. I memorize Psalm 138, which is about being grateful and thankful, Jonathan.
Yeah.
And what happened going into this year was it was a new job, right? I had come off of being laid off with a lot of my great coworkers in October of last year. I got this job relatively quickly through an old friend. And so we dove in, and it was a big struggle. And I was looking at myself and had some back issues. And lo and behold, the place I was getting my back worked on had a TM place. And so I was interested. The guy that works on my back had actually chatted about it before, said it was helpful with his divorce. It was instrumental as he got through a really, really tough time. So I dove into this, started a process, and ended up meeting somebody who actually knows Keanu Reeves, believe it or not. So we were talking about that as we were going through the Matrix. We'll keep that on the side note. But what I'm getting at is by doing that, and by spending time in my mind, being still, refreshing, being relaxed, and just tapping into that unified field of consciousness, right? When you get to that level of real deep meditation through a mantra, I believe that the heart work was already starting to work. So I noticed that my eyes would well up, not necessarily with emotion, but just something going on. And I started feeling more things about my heart and other people and care. And, I don't know what the end result was, but I didn't really manifest things the way you would typically see somebody on Instagram tell you about how to manifest, right? I just kind of went with the punches. And
Do you think you believed? Because at the core of manifesting is belief. Do you think you believed you would have a good year?
I did not believe I was going to have a good year.
What? Really?
Back in the spring.
Well, yeah. When did this job start?
Well, the job started in December, and
Okay.
most of
And
my
it
colleagues
started with a bang. Tell them why it started with a bang. With
well,
your
I don't
whole
know if it
crew.
started with a bang. What's that?
When your whole crew got let go.
Okay, so here's what happened. There was a layoff in January of this year, and
No, so you got hired in December.
Yes, and
And
then
then
there was a layoff in
yeah,
January. Now that
yes.
affected a few transitory people, some engineers, and a couple sales devs. But then, after I'd already started meditating and diving into the unified field, there was another layoff, and it was a decimation. Right, it got rid of
Right.
a lot of people,
And
including
you survived.
I survived. That's what I
Yeah.
think you led to be important, and Jonathan, and this is what Sean
Yeah.
talks about. Right, is
Right.
about you are in that space, and I call it serendipity that I'm the last person standing, or call it the pendulum
Mhm.
swinging back because I was tapping into the source. And that's, remember when I said, when you say going back, getting that pendulum swing back to where you want it to be, because it's been on a bad side. He
Mhm.
goes, yeah, well, you tap into that by tapping into meditation and unified field. That's how you get that swing back. And so it's been real. It just hasn't. I'm trying to figure out. I always like to be, there are times, Jonathan, where you and we talked about me dwelling on something like that one big deal I was working on, and I obsessed over it to the level that I actually made a mistake and we didn't get the deal. Now it's all to be said whether we're actually going to end up getting it later on, but there are things where I had a great chat today with a guy who loves our podcast, who I met in the sauna, who I told him about our podcast, who now wants to have regular meetings with me. And what we talked about today was the way you manifest and bring things together is you are absolutely present in the moment.
Mhm.
Your kids are going to be legacies. You're going to leave behind a legacy of love and kindness and abundance, not because you're obsessed about what that looks like in the future, but because you're doing the things today,
Mhm.
investing in them, loving on them, nurturing in them, hanging out with your spouse and going through arguments and having a groundedness so they understand what that looks like. And by the time you get there, it's already being manifested along the way. So the idea is everything you do is intentional, whether you eat or whether you look at that sunrise, everything you do in that moment. We talked about enjoying a meal and thinking about what it's going to taste like and what the energy can do to your body and how you have gratitude. And if you do that, or you do the dishes, or you do expenses, you do them in the moment and you focus and do that and don't worry about other things. And
Mhm.
those other things will come as part and parcel of you doing the things in the present moment. That was a
Mhm.
long diatribe, but still, that's what we talked about today, and I absolutely believe it.
But here's the thing that I think you did do, because you and I talked a lot about it when you got your job, is you did choose to believe. You and I had many conversations. I don't think you're giving yourself credit for how much you did do.
Okay.
And I think it, like going through that whole layoff, I remember how it's like, because here's the thing, once you start ascending, once you start elevating your life and going after it, there's always that first shelf. You reach it and you're like, hell yes. Like this is possible. I've elevated my life. And then something happens that tries to knock you down. That layoff, it played with you, but it also reminded you that you were supposed to be there. You were the one they kept. And
Yes.
I think that's the thing, is it's important when we get to those shelf levels to look for signs that remind us we're supposed to be here. Because it's easy to forget all the work and slog it was just to get up one elevation. The hardest part is most people don't get to the first elevation. They don't. They don't get up to that first level to go, oh shit, it's possible. They
Yes.
just assume it's not possible. And you and I had many conversations where you said, I'm just going to give this a try. You believed in yourself. And that's that first level of courage. Like Dr. Hawkins, that's 200. All you're doing is believing in yourself. And I heard you talk about it a lot. And it is not coincidental that you're having 350% of plan. For people who don't understand that, what does that mean?
Well, it means making a lot of money and also
It
trying to
means you
be a
did
leader.
350% more than they asked you to.
Exactly. Yeah. My quota was, call it 100 and something thousand. I ended up selling 444. Right. So it was pretty awesome. It was based on nurturing some great relationship with some iconic brands. And they love us and we love them. And it was effortless, to be honest, in many ways.
And I think
Because
it's a good fit for you too.
yeah, it's a scale.
Yeah.
And this is what you've got to learn about life is like, how do you do the things that you know what you can do and you have control over and invest in those so they lead the biggest outcomes? Don't bang
Yep.
your head against something that is an outside chance that's just going to leave you frustrated. Invest in the things and double down on them, right? So,
Yeah. No, I'm glad to have you back. I like doing this with you rather than without you. And we had some great guests, but it's always better with you. And because I think you provide a different balance than I do, and I think it's always better to have. But for our listeners today, you'll notice we don't have a guest today, and we have been talking about a subject for quite a long time. And I think Rich and I have the same ideals, but not the same tax. And that is the topic of transgender. And so I floated this idea by Rich, I think, what about 2, 3 months ago, and said, what if we did an
Okay.
episode on this? And just to talk about it as two people having a real conversation, um, because it's a very, very touchy subject that this concept of transgender has exploded onto our culture really over the last probably what 7, 8 years, especially since social media.
Yes.
And it's created such an intensity that we thought it would be really cool to just talk about it, maybe let a little bit of the oxygen out of the bubble by talking about it and seeing, sharing real feelings and really kind of talking about how we feel about it. I think both Rich and I feel comfortable about sharing that. But it's not that we're going to solve the problem, but by communicating and talking about it, hopefully we can come to some sense of better understanding. Because I'll tell you, from looking at a lot of the data as I was preparing for this and looking at a lot of the data, I realized, how much I didn't know. And so why don't we start? And so a big part of this is trying to really be cognizant and aware and understanding. And to start, I thought I'd share a little bit about my perspective that Rich and I talked about. So I have a friend who actually transitioned. I was in a men's Bible study group with this person, and we went to the same church. And his name was Dave. And then I moved away. And then we stayed friends on Facebook. And then Dave came out as Debbie. And it was kind of a surreal experience. It was my first strong connection because I've met transgender people before. When I was in business in 1993 with my partner, his uncle was transgender. So I had experiences, and I've actually met people who, through my blog, who were transgender, but never in a deep relationship where I knew them and they actually went through the transition. And there were obvious, really interesting experiences with that you can probably imagine. But I remember just going, I would love to know what Debbie thinks. Like it was at the beginning, it was like almost this, even learning to say a different name became, oh, something is different here. And I think that's the first thing that I want to talk about with you, Rich, is what do you think this uh, concept, the idea of being transgender, of saying I'm first a female or a male and then becoming the other or they or none, because you can include that. What do you think that it's done from your perspective to the psyche of America? What is the tension for you about someone saying, I am male becoming female, or like Dave to Debbie?
Yeah. For me, I think it's a lot of different things. Part of it, Jonathan, is I think a rallying cry for a civil rights kind of process. Right? We've gone
Mhm.
through the point of the '60s where African Americans definitely underrepresented, marginalized, and we had the civil rights movement, which was absolutely critical to try to bring equality to the
Mhm.
masses. We know the idea of redlining and the Great Migration and how there's been some unfortunate kind of side effects of how we've treated the African American community. And then in the '70s, you had Stonewall, right, and you had the LGBTQ community that kind of came
Mhm.
out. And I think what we're seeing now is, hey guys, this is happening more and more. You can't avoid it. It's real, and let's embrace it and try to help these people out, and because they're real people, right? So there is the
Mhm.
social civil rights aspect of it, but it's also gaining a lot of notoriety because you're seeing it start to interject with women's sports. So there's so
Mhm.
many different compartments that we have going on with this, and I don't know how we want to fully divvy it up, Jonathan. But you and I have agreed,
Well,
and
let's
I
do this.
Well,
let's talk
I
about
want to
what
lead
are
with
the
love,
big points.
right? Lead with love, lead with understanding,
Yeah.
but also realize that there's a lot of different components to this. So let's just say, first and foremost, what I would say is it's become more visible because it's become more of a kind of a social justice, more of a civil rights movement, but it's also gained dramatically in terms of pure numbers. Like you can't
Mhm.
avoid it. It's basically, imagine if you watched a community have five people with cancer, and 3 years later there was 20,000 people with cancer, right? And you'd never see anything like it. So I'm not trying to use it in a negative standpoint, but going back to what I talked about earlier this morning or this afternoon, in 2007 there was one clinic that was dedicated in the United States to transgender kinds of body dysphoria, people that would go in and they would ask for help or guidance or perhaps some kind of ways to with hormones or any kinds of notions, that was dedicated to the transgender community. There are now 300. So you've gone from one in 2007 to 300 today. So the question really is that a construct of physiology and genetics and people just waking up immediately, or is there more of a social construct to what's going on there? And there's a gal named Abigail Schreier, who's from Colombia, who's had a book that's been highlighted by The Economist and the London Times, and it's about in her mind some of the rush and the what we call social contagion that is part of the trans movement, not just it as such and as a whole. That's the first thing I want to say.
So one of the things I'll pull out of there is this cultural shift as documented by so in what was the first year when there was one?
2007.
2001? 2007 there's one, and now there's 300. Part of my research I found was in 2017, so this is about in the middle, there was about 150,000 people in the United States who actively declared they were transgender. And so if you do the math, that's about 500 per clinic. So per year, that sounds about right, depending how big the clinics are.
You said
But it's probably,
150,000 identified
and this is in 2017.
out of what, 330 million?
Yes. So, but that's actively declared. So you probably got to guess the number's probably double or triple or maybe even quadruple. And I think the number is dramatically larger now.
That would
Um,
make sense because that wouldn't even be in the spectrum. So typically, what we've seen is the trans movement. If you were to identify the global population as trans, it's about 0.05%, I believe, and that number is 0.00045. So that's like 2/100ths off in that regard. So anyway, we're going
well,
down a
let me
rabbit hole here.
actually let me ping on something that you said, which is, and I'm going to share a thought and tell me what you think of it. Is you mentioned that social aspect of, I think we are reaching a point that we are living the outcome of a postmodern society. Okay. And a big part of that postmodern society was the absence of historical religious morality that defined culture. And now, as that broke down really heavily as we turned into the new millennium, people started really recognizing, hey, I don't have to worry about my community's judgment of me
Yes,
because nobody goes to church meaningfully anymore. I mean, there are obviously people who do, but
of
it's
course,
come down dramatically. Its impact on
hugely,
culture has been dramatically reduced.
right.
And now people are free to say, hey, who do I think I am? And there's no rule because I have freedom to define myself. And I think because of that
Libertarian freedom.
social dynamic, the idea is magnified because culturally, when you see it on Instagram or TikTok or wherever, or any kind of social media or even public media in the news, you start recognizing this is there, and it forces people to really deal with it. What do you think of that?
I think you're spot on. I think that first and foremost, you're absolutely right. We are in a postmodern world where the big meta narratives have all come crashing down. Like, here is the end all be all of how we got here. Here's economics. Here's you
Mhm.
know there was Marx, there was Freud, and there's people realizing there's a lot of nuances, and it's not one big meta narrative. And that same thing holds for religion, right? We're seeing the people escape that confine, and they're going off and they're doing their own thing, and they're getting a lot of information from a lot of different sources, right? I mean, the Pete Ends of the world, which is like the Bible for normal people, where you've got people who grew up in a dogmatic situation. They always had something scratching in the back of their head. They go, that doesn't seem right. And like, oh my gosh, I'm meeting like-minded people who felt the same thing. And there's freedom here, right? And it's like, gosh, I would never been really comfortable in this body. I've always chafed the wrong way. I've always wanted to play with different things. And I knew there was something different going on. What does that end up looking like, right? And so I think the idea of postmodernism is, unfortunately, the end result of postmodernism is nihilism. That's what we talked about
Mhm.
with our friend Brittany. So
Right.
there has to be a stopping point, but at the same time, there is this room for expansion and for growth. And also, I think COVID was also a big slap in the face of, not only are we in a postmodern culture, but I'm really confused on a lot of different things about what real structures are, right? What I can trust. There's a lot of confusion going on. I'm in this new medium of being displaced from people, and
Mhm.
I'm confused and depressed more than I've ever been, right? Because I don't know what the future looks like, right? There's a lot
The
of
world got
uncertainty.
really small, like
Yes.
really small for the first time in decades. COVID disrupted everything. So we had COVID. What do you think that did to the movement?
Well, I think one of the things it did is it allowed a lot more autonomy in terms of freedom of expression.
Mhm.
When COVID was there, you had people that were having a hard time dealing with the new
Yeah.
digital communication, right? And so there was forgiveness, and for all good reason, right? There was a lot of people who said, Let's look at this. We're having a hard time communicating. We have a hard time getting assignments done." I think there was a lot of other kinds of freedoms, like, I don't know what's going on with my body. I'm having a hard time chatting with my parents about it. It could be a lot of different things, but I think a lot of people came out of COVID in terms of like the sense of the connective tissue that normally people have in support groups were gone. And so now,
Yeah.
well, the support groups became more digital and more impersonal, if you would. And yet there was still influence, right? I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of that going on. And so there's a lot of
And a lot
disinformation.
of people lost a lot of people.
That's
Like
correct.
that's one of the things we don't really talk about COVID is in COVID, what was the final death rate? Like 5 million people? Like that's
A
a lot
million,
of
I think, at
people.
least in the United States, right? I think we lost over a
Yeah.
million. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like that sense of pervasiveness of death, like this thing could kill you, really changes people, and I think that may have magnified the sense of freedom. I love that we're starting on this idea because I think that's the best part of transgenderism is someone coming to a sense of integrity about what they think they are. The journey of who they are is for them to determine. But I love that part because when I sat with Debbie, who I used to know as Dave, and I have to let go of my sense of this is now Dave. But I sat there and we met at Facebook for lunch, and I just listened to her. And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, this is her.
I know you keep saying that. And it's an intentional, it's not like a
It has to
natural
be
thing for you. It
intentional.
takes effort, right? You have to think about it intentionally.
Yes. So I'm having to change my construct that is historical for as long as we've been alive as human beings. This is a new construct. Doesn't mean it didn't exist, but it's the first time we're grappling with it like this. And I had to tell myself, Deb, I remember sitting there going, don't say Dave. And it was like, oh God, because I wanted to empathize. This was a friend of mine. This wasn't someone who I didn't know. I knew this person well
Close
as Dave.
conversations, right? You got some
Right.
probably intimate chats with a small group of men. Yep.
And this is the first time I had actually met Debbie and in person. So it was, but I remember feeling for Debbie at that time, man, I'm glad for the freedom this person is experiencing. And I think that's the beginning of the journey for those who are watching it happen or those who are experiencing it is that moment of freedom is what I think everybody wants for those people. Okay. But the problem is the dynamic doesn't end there. Okay. And so to tee that up, what I want to do is I want to tee up a conversation that Rich and I had before.
And I were forced to undress in the presence of Leah, a 6'4" tall biological male, fully intact with male genitalia, 18 times per week. Some girls opted to change in bathroom stalls, and others used the family bathroom to avoid this. When we tried to voice our concerns to the athletic department, we were told that Leah's swimming and being in our locker room was a non-negotiable, and we were offered psychological services to attempt to re-educate us to become comfortable with the idea of undressing in front of a male. To sum up the university's response, we, the women, were the problem, not the victims. We were expected to conform, to move over, and shut up. Our feelings didn't matter. The university was gaslighting and fear-mongering women to validate the feelings and identity of a male.
So when I see that, I think that is the beginning of the tension. As anybody who's transgender in a world that already exists, there's always a give and take of respect and love for each other that is we hope for. And that's all I want to do now is listen to that journey, because I don't wish Dave or Debbie. See, I just did it. See, that's the thing is it's a transition. When the person who's transgender starts living out that life, there are constructs that they're going to rub up against. And one of those is sports. That's probably the easiest one to sort of talk about. And what are the impacts of that? I'm going to let you start with this one. What's your perspective on this?
Well, I was listening, believe it or not, to Fox News a couple nights ago, and the only liberal on the 5 that comes out at 4 o'clock put a hard stop on biological men competing in women's sports. She's on the left of everyone there, definitely pro-choice, right? All that, get rid of guns, right? Global warming is real. All of the things you can think of that are traditional left of center progressive person, and she's always the counter, right, to the people that are on the right. And she said, "I don't believe that it's fair for women who have worked their whole life NCAA sports, who are competing like Riley Gaines, to then be shut down. Where you've got people like Leah Thomas, who was 400th and became first and second, was blowing out the field." And a lot of people would come to the table say, well, the difference isn't that strong. They're taking blockers, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, David Pakman, who's a very left of center person, had Dennis Prager on, who's very right. And the idea of women, biological men in women's sports, even David Pakman said, in several sports, it's an absolute advantage. I'm just going to throw it out there. And so this is what's interesting, Jonathan, because we're actually in a place where we're actually bringing together objective truths, which are that this man and this woman, both at the top of their game, if the man was to compete with the woman in any kind of strength lifting or tennis, Serena Williams would have been kicked off Letterman 10 years ago because she said, "I don't want to go against the men competing with me. They destroy me. There's just no comparison." And she is amazing, right? This is a very
the greatest,
one of the greatest, right? And
she's the greatest tennis player, but that's an important distinction. She is probably the closest to a masculine, like she's a powering figure.
She's absolutely
like close,
physical
like
specimen
right there.
Absolutely. She's
she
incredible.
Could probably beat people in the top 100.
Yeah. So going back to this is a very easy discussion for me, Jonathan. It's very easy for me to say that's an unfair thing, especially for people who have dedicated their whole lives to this process, right? And to me, it shows a great deal of unfairness to take a 0.5% or a couple others. And because as I want to make a quick distinction here, just a couple days ago, there was a female kind of like tech event where a whole bunch of guys came in and registered as non-binary, and they showed up and they took over the entire place, and it was a big flummoxed mess. And what was really sad about that was these guys clearly were not non-binary. They just did it to take advantage. And there's going to be a point in time where somehow, somewhere, you have to realize that somebody's actually taking advantage of a scenario versus really going through a lot of pain and suffering. And if Leah Thomas really was gender dysmorphic and had a terrible time, then he probably would have chopped his appendage off and then became Leah and transformed. Now, I'm not saying everybody should do that. Kylie, what is his name? Caitlyn Jenner didn't do it. And Caitlyn seems to be living a good, healthy life. But going back to it, that's a line that I will not cross. And that is, I do not believe biological men should be competing in women's sports, especially at the levels of what we've been seeing in the news, especially on that video.
And here's my perspective, because I think that's sort of like that first ring of the conflict circle. It's easy to define because you're saying men or women changing gender. It's more pronounced when a man becomes a woman, that they can overtake the women who are at the very, very top. Like you said,
Well, how many
Leah,
trans men are going to be competing? Why don't you show me the
you
amount
won't
of
have a trans
excitement
woman
in the world of a female transitioning to a man and competing against the men's sport? Why don't we talk about that for a few moments?
So here's how I would break that down: is this is the first time when we're really, so all sports are typically defined by a construct of gender. Are there any sports that actually intermingle? Although there are women playing
Curling,
men's sports.
curling.
Curling, true. But for
I've
the
been to
vast
some
majority of
male-female
sports,
teams.
they're separated by gender, because males, physiological males, are have more strength and capacity from a muscle density perspective. So it's a biological advantage.
Correct.
Okay? And the problem is that that has always been very clearly defined. And when a transgender man takes that advantage and goes over to the other category, he's sort of creating a new category.
Correct.
And that creates an unfair advantage, as shown by what's happening in sports with transgender athletes, that they are now obliterating women's records.
Correct.
And so therein lies the question of, what's the most healthy way to solve this? Is, I think the reality is that if someone is transgender and wants to compete in sports, because sports is a choice, it's not a life-giving situation where you have to survive. You choose sports. Not saying you shouldn't choose sports, but if you're transgender, you have to recognize you're choosing something and going against the construct that has existed really since the Athens Games. I mean, it's like since we've been doing sports. And that's the conflict for me. Like you said, is when a biologically born male changes sex over to a female, they still maintain some significant biological advantages that women could never produce on their own. And I think that makes it a third category for me that says, hey, listen, whole new world. And that's where I want to protect the integrity, but recognize it, that do we need to create a transgender games or something where athletes who are transgender compete against each other, but can you leverage the biological advantage inherent to who you were born as? I don't know if that, because history is, it's not like we're projecting here. There are clear examples of people who do transgender, change from a biological male to a female, and dominate where they didn't do that before. So I think I'm with you on this one, that there's either got to be a third category, because there's got to be some recognition on the part of the transgender person to say, I'm the one changing the game, and take responsibility for that. It's okay. We start with freedom, but then there's a sense of responsibility that has to come with that freedom.
Freedom with consequences, right? Like you mentioned, you're going to rub up against certain constraints, right? And so, and the question also is, and this is Jordan Peterson's biggest concern, is I'm okay to call you by your preferred pronouns. As a one-on-one person, to defer respect and understanding to a conversation, I'm willing to do that. But when the Canadian government is mandating me to call people by their pronouns and becomes a constitutional or a statutory imperative,
It's against
that's
freedom of
when
speech.
correct. That's called freedom of speech. And that's when he did that. And Dave Chappelle, of course, is comedic in terms of I'm happy for you to do whatever you want to do. As a libertarian, Dave Chappelle goes, if you want to go be you, go be you. Just don't invite me to that world and force me to be a part of your world. You go be you. Don't force me to be a part of that identity, right? So, I mean, that's what I think.
That's sort of the next layer in the conflict, which is where, back to that video with Leah, the female athletes were mandated to have him in the locker room with them. That's where I think, again, we're saying the mental health of the transgender person is more important than the female athletes who did nothing to change.
Yes.
That's where I think it becomes the responsibility of the choice is lacking in recognizing the empathy of the other person, because what a transgender person wants, is the freedom to be themselves. Totally agree. But then the freedom to live their life. We still live in a culture that has established norms that are clearly established. My responsibility is then to learn how to adapt in those and then make change. I'm not against having a transgender games. I think that would be awesome.
Of course.
But recognize that there's too many biological differences that they're not inconsequential. And especially in terms of changing, like you said, Leah never had a sex change. Right.
It's called bottom surgery. Yeah. So Leah, and that's one of the questions I would have is, if Leah did have bottom surgery, and which is a vaginoplasty, I believe what the medical term is, would they feel a little bit less scared instead of seeing, full intact? I think what she described it as male genitalia there. That's got to be intimidating. And then we don't even know kind of if there was this idea of Leah like lingering eyes on female bodies, right? The feeling of violation of space and things like that. And maybe Leah just wanted to be themselves and just wanted to be intact, and that's something we have to take into consideration. But the fact that it was forced, and then they had to go through psychological training and re-education to say, listen, it sounds like you're being very hateful here. We need to get you into some training. And that just seems to me, you need to grow this with love and with honey, not with vinegar, right? And so I think that all of us, if we could look at the lens, this is where we are. We always have to go back on this, Jonathan. We look through the lens of love and the pain that's gone through a lot of these folks' lives, and their pain and potential suicide, and how do you come to meet them in a safe place? And
let me interject here, because this is an important point. Violence against transgender people is 4 times as high as cisgender. Okay, so we cannot debate
cisgender,
whether or not,
cisgender. You said violence against trans is 4 times more than what?
Cisgender or cisgender.
Cisgender. Yes. Cisgender? Okay. Yeah, it's terrible. Yeah,
I don't even know what I am. It's like how to pronounce it. I've never actually learned.
You're a cisgender. So there's cis and there's natal. There's cisgender and natal gender, right? So cisgender says I identify with the of the sex of my birth, and a natal gender says that I'm actually also born with that genitalia. I mean, I just saw a little 15-minute as a doctor who does surgeries actually, and he's done some top surgery. So I wanted to get a perspective on that. So there's cisgender and natal gender, but most of us call ourselves I'm cis het, for instance, right? That means that I identify with the sex of my birth, and I happen to be heterosexual, right? So you could be a cis.
So let me read you some of the important, because this is sort of the second ring of the conflict. What happens when a transgender person leaves their cocoon of, they've come into their own identity and says, okay, I am a transgender person. Then they begin interacting in the world. What happens? So this is from UCLA's Williams Institute study. Transgender people are victimized 4 times more often than cisgender people. 86.2% of victimizations per 1,000 compared to 21% for cisgender. Transgender women and men had higher rates of violent victimization than cisgender women and men. Is it 86 to 23 and 107? So women are a lot more. Actually, men are more, which is interesting.
Trans men.
Yes, more transgender men are victimized.
Okay.
1 in 4 transgender women who were victimized thought the incident was a hate crime compared to less than 1 in 10 cisgender women. Transgender households had a higher rates of property victimization than cisgender households. So it's clear to begin with the idea that as someone who's coming into their sense of freedom is going to encounter a lot of hate. That
Yes.
is absolutely happening. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I think it's very, it's about fear. That it is hate, but it's also fear, right? People fear that, and they react in a terrible way, right? And so violence against.
Why do you? So actually, let me do this. Why do you think, from your perspective, why do you think people are afraid of transgender people?
Well, Jonathan, it's
Not just
because
yours, but what
it's
do you think people in general?
if the trans movement is really 0.5%,
Mhm.
people fear what they don't know, what they don't understand, and there's, I mean, they're called freaks, right? Clearly, right? They're called other kinds of things, and I think that rather than trying to understand, why they've gone through that, it's a shame. And here's the other thing: what's really unfortunate is I've seen a lot of pictures of people who used to be a good-looking dude or a beautiful young lady, and they've transitioned, and they are a shadow of what they used to look like. And there's something, as you can tell, broken in there where they might have taken on more masculine features, but they certainly have taken on darker, less beautiful features. I think, and this is my bad, right? I think Ellen Page, in Inception, for instance, and she was in, that movie where she had a baby. I forget the name of it, but she was Ariadne in Inception. You and I love Christopher Nolan. We love
One of my
Oppenheimer.
favorite movies. Yeah.
Interstellar. We love Inception. And so she's this architect, and I see what she looks like today. She just doesn't look as happy. What I'm getting to you by that is that when people do go through a transition, they often don't look like a atypical person. So somebody looks at that and they have this reaction. And instead of trying to understand and go deeper into what caused them to do that, because Ellen Page clearly in I don't know what Ellen's new name is. I apologize for not knowing, but Ellen clearly had massive internal concerns, right? There was this idea that I'm not in this right body,
Elliot.
right? So Ellen had a double mastectomy, right?
It's Elliot.
Elliot now, yes, and
Yes.
Elliot's got the scars now, right? And
Mhm.
Elliot's,
And showed them. Yeah.
exactly. I think it was a GQ, or there was
Mhm.
definitely a magazine thing. What I'm getting at is that this is not that different from the violence against African Americans as they started to become more and more populous, right, and had more and more presence. And I think people feared that, and they started saying, "What's going on here? Why can't they, be in their own community?" It happened with the gay community, with the famous Matthew Shepard getting, really violently killed, and in like Montana or something. And now we're just seeing another version of it coming out, and it's all based on fear. Unfortunately, it doesn't also help that there seems to be a very large narrative being pushed along amongst the mainstream media and social media that you better get used to it. And that's not the way. It shouldn't be forced. It should be understood in the lens of love as opposed to any kind of forced process. You know what I mean?
Well, let's jump into the hard part,
Yeah.
which is what is essentially called the woke culture. I'm going to play you a video.
Gender do you think you are?
Well, I'm a male.
Okay, well, I think you're a woman.
No, legally I'm a male.
Oh,
It says on my driver's license that I'm a
I
male.
say I don't believe you.
It doesn't matter.
Exactly, it doesn't matter if you don't believe me.
No, it doesn't matter because
What
biologically,
gender do you think I am?
I would assume you're female.
Yeah, see, you're making assumptions.
Yes.
I identify as non-binary.
I don't, respectfully, it doesn't matter.
It matters my gender expression. It matters the way that I'm allowed to express myself. It matters what bathroom I use. It matters who I'm allowed to live with. It affects every aspect of my life. So you saying...
What pronoun should I use?
You should use they, them pronouns. So you saying that you
And what
don't
if I
believe
don't?
me...
What if I don't?
If you don't, I would consider that disrespectful, and that's actually an act of violence to misgender, trans...
It's an act of violence.
That is an act of violence to intentionally misgender someone.
So that's
I
a
would
crime.
consider that
An act of violence against you is a crime. We have no idea how many pronouns there are. We can never know how many pronouns there are. And to not use a proper pronoun
You could ask.
is an act of violence against them.
Okay. How would you respond?
To me, this is not an act of violence. It is an inappropriate, mean-spirited way of interacting with somebody. So again, I think it is. I think it is a terrible dereliction of the English language to tell somebody that just because they're not calling you by their preferred pronouns, that's an act of violence against them.
Mhm.
I don't think that. And I think it's inappropriate. I think here's a perfect. You know what?
What's inappropriate?
Here's an example. There's a doctor, an MD, and a chiropractor that are being
Mhm.
introduced at a dinner conversation.
Mhm.
And the guy who's brought them together says, "Hey, Bill, you're a chiropractor, and hey, Jim, you're a doctor." And the doctor says to the chiropractor, "Well, you might be a gentleman, sir, but you're no doctor." And he turns to the other guy and goes, "Well, you might be a doctor, sir, but you're no gentleman." Right? So the doctor bags on the chiropractor because he's not a true doctor, right? He's not a true medical school guy. But the key of that whole moment is like, well, you might be a doctor, sir, but you're sure not a gentleman. And I think that's the person who looked worse in that situation was the MD who was not calling the chiropractor a doctor. And so what I'm getting at with that whole concept is
Mhm.
if we want to live in a world that tries to get along and be unified in as
Mhm.
many ways as possible, I think you should do whatever you can to help out that process. But for somebody to force the construct of law, of like
Mhm.
physical law, let's say this is actual hate crime, this is actual statutory. If you call me by,
Mhm.
if it's on camera and you've been caught like doing it, or maybe you screwed up 3 or 4 times, and then they
It
really want to
is
nail
a
you,
fact. It's
right?
not the same as I'm going to kill you.
Oh,
As a
of course not.
verbal, and that's the thing is why is he or she or them, they, whatever is misgendering that concept of an act of violence. It may feel like it, but that does not rise to the concept of violence. But
Thank you.
here's the problem is I see the transgender person saying, when is someone going to fucking recognize me? And I think that's the tension here is that next level of freedom is because I agree, you can't mandate against free speech and say you have to, and if you don't, that's an act of violence. It's kind of a silly argument. But from the position of the transgender person, it's much more about recognition as a category. And I think that's what the world is pushing back on because it's coming fast, it's coming into schools. Most transgender people are children. So that's the hard part is that it's the exploratory nature of it is freaking a ton of people out. That let's go to the next ring then. When it starts impacting children,
Can we
okay?
take a quick pause before we go there? So
Yes.
I, I want to embrace and love on everybody who's on a genuine
I want
journey.
you to be
And
as honest as you want to be, dude.
yeah, I want to embrace anybody who's on that journey and who's
Mhm.
lived a life of pain and they're in their 20s, or maybe they're younger, maybe they're, 40 years old, and they go, I don't know, I don't believe in God anymore. This is a crisis of faith. Right now, we're actually seeing a crisis of body dysphoria. When Riley Gaines, one of these swimmers, was going to be at a university, kind of protesting and saying why she's fighting
Mhm.
in her own swim lanes against biologically female athletes. There was a room. She was assaulted. There was 30 or 40 or 50, 60 people that were there that were gathered, and they were full of hate and vitriol.
Mhm.
And I believe, Jonathan, there's a lot of people who have lived their lives that have been marginalized, but because they're not fit in really well, they're looking at this as an actual opportunity to get their spotlight. And the people that are violent, and there are people that after that transgender person shot up that school in Nashville, there was these transgender people that were on video like, freaking A, we're gonna fight back now. We're gonna come out and we're gonna freaking start shooting people. Those
Mhm.
people that are getting violent and have vitriol and like, you need to do this for my sake.
Right.
That is not, I think, the embodiment of the people we're looking for here. And
No, that's when it becomes authoritarian is that the
correct,
mass has to accommodate the few.
correct. And going back to my daughter Ari, she's got 30% of her high school drama class was trans. I met Lewis
Right.
and Ren, and I met a lot of these kids who were just they were in pain, and they were trying to figure out that new expression, being creative, surrounding themselves with good people who loved on each other, and they had a lot of fun, and they were very entertaining, and they were amazing, right? And that's a different kind of construct, and something to support and
Hmm.
to try to embrace. In this young guy Ren, who's transitioned, I heard Ren's voice. His voice was deeper, right? And he drew this amazing picture of our dog that died, that had sarcoma, osteosarcoma. And
Yeah.
there's some healthy stuff going on there, and this community that brings and lifts people up. That's the kind of thing that I would look to, support as much as I can.
Hmm.
And yet at the same time, I am regaling against this forced authoritarian, vitriolic, you better do this or else
Hmm.
they'll be hell to pay. And that just doesn't seem to be the right temper and temperament of the movement.
Yeah, I think we both agree is that there has, in other words, and we're speaking from positions of privilege as white males.
Of
Okay, I want
course.
to call that out. Uh, it's the safe space. My interest is the safe healing space, not power.
Of course.
We don't want force. And the what's happening, I think, is the surge of freedom, and then they're trying to deal with all of the consequences of the rings. People are afraid. Why would you change what God made? Things like that. But here's what's interesting is when I sat down with Debbie, she told me that when she was, I think, a child, like 7, she knew. And I think part of what you and I have wrestled with as we've talked about this offline is this concept of when should children be allowed to make those kinds of decisions, and then to throw a little bit of a ringer into it when the parent gets involved to kind of push the child into that. So that here's the thing. My interest is children are the most vulnerable part of this.
I agree.
And so what's a healthy response look like from your perspective?
Well, I think that here's the if I want to be as objective as possible, I want to start talking about the science of clinical trials, of what attempts there are to come alongside these kids in terms of helping
Mhm.
them, with puberty blockers or with medication. Now, there's a lot of people we're holding off on that, but what I want to understand is, let us see a group of people like the tomboy girls, right? I've seen a lot of people on Twitter who go, "Oh my God, I was hitting baseballs, I was playing with trucks, and I'm now mom of 5, yada yada yada." Right? But by God, back then, if you had picked me up when I was 9 and said, "Okay, I think you're a dude now, let's go," that might have been something happened. They're looking back, so I don't think we have enough clinical evidence to show what happens in this group of 1,000 kids where 22% of them feel like they're kind of out of sorts, and Bill likes playing with Barbies, and
Mhm.
Sasha likes playing with sports cars, right?
Right.
And even then, I think it's a silly kind of thing, because there shouldn't be any. I mean, guys wear pink, right? Like this silly notion of boys
Mhm.
wear blue and girls wear pink
Look at
is
what
kind
happened with Barbie, with the movie. Guys
of,
can wear pink.
I didn't. Yeah, exactly. I didn't watch it yet. I only saw snippets of the kids watching it. But what I'm getting at is that we need better statistics. We need better stuff to say, hey, listen, we've taken 1,000 kids and we put them on puberty blockers. They were at 12, 11, 12 years old. They feel like they're out of sorts. Let's arrest this puberty, get them to go the direction that they feel that their body is telling them to go, or their heart is telling them to go. And let's look at that and see, does that actually increase their level of life in a positive way, or does it not? And I think we're still too soon. That's my biggest thing right now. Certainly, you and I both love our brains. You talk about amygdala all the time. We talk about the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, and
And
what blows my
that
mind.
go there. Go there,
Not
because I think that's one of the most important parts.
Yeah. we all know that Hertz and Avis will not allow you to rent a freaking car until you turn 25. I don't care if you're driving when you're 16. You're not
We can't
touching
go
this.
to war until you're 18.
Yeah,
You can't drink until you're 21. You can't vote. Why? Because you don't have command of your prefrontal cortex yet. And to the
100%.
point you just made is, here's the thing. I think there should be a universal mandate about any sex change transition. Counseling, fine. Explore it, fine. But no physiological, no anything physical that you can ingest until around 11, because that's when the prefrontal cortex comes on. And the reason why we don't let you go to war or vote is because you suck at making good decisions when you're a child.
Yes.
And so I look at, but to my own point, I look at this and go, how would I respond to Debbie to say, should I stop you? And I think that's the tension for me, is I don't want to keep Debbie from freedom. But I
Well,
also want to help Debbie make healthy choices if that's her path. So that's the tension for me.
if Dave became Debbie at a young age, so Dave had a wife and kids. Am I not
Yes.
wrong?
Wife
I
and
mean,
2 kids. Yes.
classic, beautiful family, middle Americana, right?
Yep.
Evangelical community, everybody just going through the motions, right? And I'm imagining there was a lot of pain and confusion.
Yeah.
I had a good friend from college. Everybody always thought he was gay in college. There was a lot of gay guys in my fraternity. And quite frankly, everybody loved him. And he
He's
ended
like,
up getting
hey,
married.
you're gay. When are
Yeah.
you going to wake up? Right.
Yeah. He just
Yeah.
came out literally 2 or 3 years ago. He's been married to this gal of his sweetheart from college, for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And the question really comes down to, could Dave, if he had transitioned to Debbie at an earlier stage and had been more freedom to do that, could he have done that? Now, you and I, as we look at life and we look at our linear time and Sean and what everybody would say, did he create a wonderful life for these 2 kids and for his wife? And is everything better off? Looking at the entire equation, I've transitioned now. Yes, we caused pain, but here's what the ultimate thing is. Is there even a question of whether, listen, if I had been able to go back in time and if I'd been in a world today that was gender affirming, I would have avoided all that pain and suffering for my wife and future kids. Who knows, right? That's a question we might have to ask Debbie when we bring her on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough because, well, let's do this. Let's kind of bring it home to sort of what is sort of the outer rings of the circles is this notion that all transgender people are pedophiles. Okay. And it's a huge concern for people. I don't think it's true. If you knew Debbie, you would go, no, that's not happening. It's not a universal, it's simply, what is it called? A caricature. But let me play this video for you, because I think this is going to kind of bring it home. It really is. Okay. So here's really the final point I want to end on, is this concept of there's a public notion that's completely unfair, statistically untrue, and needs to die, which is that transgender people are predisposed to pedophilia or are pedophiles. And I found this video that I think sums it up nicely.
In the last 6 months, there have been 2,145 cases for sex crimes involving children. Recently, there were 2 more Republican politicians, a Mississippi state senator, along with 3 pastors, 3 church employees, and no less than 19 Catholic priests. Out of the 34 cases involving political figures, 1 of them was a Democrat. The reason I'm bringing that up is because it's Republicans that have been screaming about drag queens and transgender, and in the last 6 months, there hasn't been 1 single drag queen. And out of the 2,145 cases that have been recorded, 3 have been transgender. And guess what? None of those have been in bathrooms. So out of all of those that have been added, police officers, teachers, coaches, in half a year, those involved in the religious industry are by far the largest employment group at 13.5%. Evangelical pastors holding up well above 6%. Which means in the past year, your child has more than 69.5% more of a chance to be abused by an evangelical pastor than a transgender person. But it's drag queens and transgender that our kids should stay away from.
What do you think?
You know, I think that is a little disingenuous from this
Okay.
standpoint.
Fair. How
If
so?
if the transgender, and let's say it's a biological male transgender that's a female, and that's perpetrating stuff, that person supposedly makes up 0.5% of the population. Of
Mhm.
course, there's going to be a lot less cases of that. But there's an entire Twitter handle called Gays Against Groomers.
Mhm.
They feel these are LGBT. These are the LGBT, but not the T community, right? There's an entire
Right.
movement. It's called LGB, but not the T. And
Mhm.
if you look at an amazing interview between Bill Maher, he interviewed Andrew Sullivan from the Daily Beast, and a gal named Katie Herzog, who feel their
Hard
entire
right.
these people are left, and they're both gay. Katie's gay, and so is Andrew. He's at the Daily Beast. He's quite
Oh,
liberal. I
I'm
think he
sorry. I thought you were talking about Andrew Tate.
no Andrew Sullivan. Andrew Sullivan.
Sullivan.
He's a
Thank you.
blogger. He's an
Oh,
author.
I love Andrew Sullivan. Yeah, he's a great writer.
So these guys are both on saying our movement's been co-opted. Right now, going back to the whole process, I don't. I think here's what here's the delineation that needs to be made for the people that you know and I know.
Mhm.
My daughter's friends, your friend Debbie, the people that are in that particular process that are hurting and want just the freedom to be themselves and express themselves, absolutely 100%. It's a terrible schema to say these people are all groomers, but then there are people who are taking advantage
Mhm.
of these scenarios and the cases of people being assaulted in stalls because they've been able to use a female's bathroom are all over the place. I'm not saying that it's proportionally worse or not. I'm just saying what that guy's statistics is cherry picked out of the blue. It'd be like saying,
Well, how do you mean it's cherry picked? Because all he did was pick the last 6 months.
what I'm saying is he didn't mention proportionally. I mean, it'd be like saying this: who causes more deaths in the country, whites or Hispanics, right? And it's probably whites,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, because we're the
It's
lightest group.
who
Yeah.
causes more, yeah, etc. I mean, you can't just say this is the purport. It has to be per capita. It has to be on another level. Now, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, there's two levels of people here. I believe there are people who are taking advantage of it, and here's what I mean by this. Now that it's become more mainstream, that's what allows the abuse to come in and take over. The
Mhm.
abuse we already just saw. Guys said, I'm non binary. They show up and they do something like stupid and they go, oh, I'm non binary. And they co opted that entire tech event for women that was designed to empower them. I
Mhm.
believe that people, and I know we have a difference of opinion on are we basically good, are we basically bad. I think what we're opening up the hood here, and we're saying how bad can people really get, and these people. I mean, the entire campus of Brown, 40% identifies as LGBTQ, right? That those kinds of ideas would have been physiologically, genetically, statistically impossible um, 10, 15 years ago, right?
Mhm.
Nobody would have agreed that were the case. So either A, they're only allowing LGBTQ into Brown, or B, they're finding that by self-identifying as LGBTQ, they're going to get a
Mhm.
better chance of getting into Brown, and that's going to help them with their processes, right? So this is what I fear. I fear that the people that are truly hurting, the ones that are just striving for being themselves, they've been beat up their whole lives, and
Yeah.
they're ready to make that transition to be their free self. They're the ones who are going to get co-opted by the people that are taking advantage of the system. That's my concern.
Yeah, and I think there's also here's the reality is as any human being comes into their own sense of freedom and begins to explore the rings of how they interact in the world, once we devolve into predatory, that's where it's a hard no. And I think what needs to happen is almost a sense of, I don't know, because then like you said, there's the groups that says, they like there is always, and I don't know what statistically it is, there's always that category that wants sex with children. Okay. Like pedophiles are actually becoming more empowered the more the gates of freedom open up
They are.
because and But that predatory element is where things have got to be a hard no for me, because a child cannot fundamentally understand the same level as an adult. And when you involve sex, then it becomes highly physical and therefore highly mental and physical trauma. So
Well,
that's my concern.
George Takei was George Takei, Sulu in Star Trek.
Love
I
him.
guess was taken advantage of when he was 13 or 14 and at camp by a camp counselor, and he said it was wonderful.
Yeah.
So
Well,
he
maybe
actually
he
had
was
a really good
predisposed
experience.
to. He was probably already. I don't know if he was. I'm just wondering. Is the understanding of it is he was gay, and so that was an enjoyable experience for him because he felt inside he was gay. Um, the question is, does that cause homosexuality? My mom was a counselor, and she actually, when she worked at City Team, she counseled a lot of men who came out because they were essentially prostitutes. City Team is a drug and rehab counseling center. People on the streets, people coming through the crime systems. And she said 100% of the men that she interviewed, small subset, had all identified they'd been sexually abused and identified as gay.
Wow.
And so it's a very small subset, but abuse was common. Now, I'm not making the statement that that's true for all gay men because I have a lot of gay family members. That it's just who they were. Um, but it's when it leads to that predatory element that there's got to be hard no, because we have to protect the children. And I think that's the way to wrap this whole thing up is I am all for freedom of anybody coming to a sense of human health and mental health to say, to come to congruence with the self. That's all I want for people. And with that comes a responsibility as you interact in the world, just like I have. I have the same sense of rules. And when it becomes predatory or when it becomes unfairly advantageous or predatory, because I think the Leah thing in the women's bathroom, that's predatory from my perspective, because it's causing mental harm on all the girls. They
It
all
is.
testify. And that's when we need to pull back and say, hey, there needs to be more responsibility. So we need to partner with the transgender community to lift up their sense of freedom, but also hold them to the responsibility of any citizen as part of this
Yeah.
community. How would you respond? Why don't you close this?
I agree 100%. I think that the conversation needs to come with understanding, and it needs to come with real good evidence-based scenarios of really healthy explorations of transition, and not the predatory kind, not the forced kind. When you see somebody who really was in 400th place in the men's division, then becomes first place, in the women's division, you could see there's an incentive there. It seems like it's an ulterior motive, completely with the fact that they haven't had bottom surgery and haven't done that full transition. So if it's truly about dysphoria, then you would have undergone gender reassignment surgery instead of taking advantage of being on the podium, and I think getting the spotlight that you didn't want before. All that being said, we do want to lead with the lens of love. We are in a world that's transitioning, that that's evolving, right? And
It is.
yeah, and so I think that's the end of it. We lead with the lens of love and understanding, but we also have to have hard kinds of. We still need the science, and we need real kind of time frames to be able to understand what the repercussions of this look like, and to come up with a better, healthy environment for everybody.
I agree.
Yeah.
So this has been another interesting episode of Living in the Matrix. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please comment, share your thoughts. Hopefully, we'll get some good conversation around this. And subscribe if you haven't. Would love to hear from our listeners. If you know anybody that you think would be a good guest on our show, please let us know. There's a way to share with us on the website, livinginthematrix.ai. And wish you all the best. Say goodbye, Rich.
Bye, everybody. Stay warm out there.
All right. Peace and much love.